All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being here. If you are able to hop onto the Zoom, we welcome you. If you're watching this later on our YouTube channel, thank you for joining us. I know a lot of our members are over at the Midwest Clinic this week, so taking the time whenever you have it to watch this video is very much appreciated. Last month, we had Haley Friedland here to talk about entrepreneurship in the music industry beyond education, and that was wonderful. But this is another ed-focused session for us today. My name is Liz Harvey. I am your Washington Music Educators Association Collegiate President, and today with us we have Pam Ivezic. Dr. Pam Ivezic is here has been a K-12 instructional services music coach for the Seattle Public Schools since 2008. Pamela has worked closely with music educators at the district level in designing culturally responsive, standards-aligned courses and student-centered curriculum and assessment tools. Thank you so much for being here, Pam. And if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about what you've been doing recently, especially after COVID as a music educator and an educator in general, please go ahead and do that.
Well, thank you, Liz. It's wonderful to be here. I so appreciate the invitation to be able to speak with you and to share what I can with our future teachers. So what I've been doing, we're still in the midst of COVID, as we know, and things are going to be changing. We just don't know. And a lot of my time is working and supporting our music teachers and their students and programs with a lot of PPE, as you can imagine, and COVID safety protocols. I'm also in the schools quite a bit working with our teachers because at the K-5 level, we are not able to sing in our classrooms still because we're being safe. And so it's really thinking about what do we teach in the curriculum, especially at K-1-2 when singing and movement is such a vital component. And so being very creative and thinking about that, as well as working to make sure that the needs of our students and our programs are being heard and being supported, particularly performances, because we know how important those are at the secondary level and also at the elementary, but definitely at the secondary level when we're thinking of recruitment and building programs. So that's what I've been doing recently.
Great. And I'm glad you said building programs because that's one of the big things we discussed we were going to talk about today. So I put as kind of the banner of our session today to be advocacy. That's kind of a hot button word in our collegiate world. If any of you who are watching this went to our NAFME National Collegiate Conference, that was one of the biggest things we talked about. So advocacy in the sense of how do we advocate for ourselves when we're coming into this new profession? How do we advocate for our students in especially situations where districts may not have music programs or we need to build a program? How do we advocate for students to get their music education? So thank you, Pam, for being here today. This is a really important thing to talk about, and I'm glad this subject felt relevant to you as well.
Always, always.
So we decided to break up the questions today to be in 3 categories. The first one you should all be familiar with is the questions are more fun. We ask every session leader, but the other 2 different sections that we're going to do are advocacy at the level of for ourselves as professionals and then for our students. So I'm just going to pop back and forth between those 2 and then we'll get to the fun ones at the end. But so let's just hop right in with the first section being advocacy for ourselves as professionals. And the first question we have here is, did you experience bias as a young professional? And connected to that, do you feel that colleagues develop their respect with added years and experience?
So when I started teaching, I definitely did feel bias, primarily in the situation that I was new to the profession and I was hired in a position where somebody who had been there for 20 some odd years had built this program, had left, been replaced with somebody for 1 year, and then they left. And the person they wanted to have in that position who was from that community was not put into that position, but I was. So I had a lot of proving I had to do. And there was a perception because I was from outside of the community. I was not from the state of Kansas. I was coming in from Colorado, even though I had done my undergrad in Kansas and I had student taught in Kansas and had subbed a lot in Kansas. I still wasn't part of that community. I was an outsider. And so I had a lot of proving to do. And of course, when you're new, some of the things that they don't think you can do is classroom management. And I will admit, that's always the biggest challenge when you're a brand new teacher and especially with new students. So I had some work to do, but I think what really helped was I built relationships with the teachers. I built relationships with administration. And most importantly, I built relationships with my students. I asked them questions and I got to know their families. In the town that I was in Kansas, football and basketball sports was really important. And the marching band was always at the events. And even though my role was choir, I still made sure I attended. I got to go to a lot of events with the band and the orchestra. So I became somebody they saw, the family saw, and the students saw. And so if I approached the students saying, hey, I know you really like to sing in your choir outside of school. Why don't you join this choir? The parents were like, yeah, I saw her at the football game, or I saw her at the track meet, or I saw her in the grocery store. Well, you should do it. And so building that relationship over time made it so that people knew me. People knew that I cared about their kiddos. And I really did care about the kiddos, because there were times where parents were deciding, should I have my kid be in choir or sign them up for another class? And, having that ability to have a relationship with families helped me build a program. And I think respect is an interesting word, because in the music world, in music education, as you know, it's not like being your 5th grade teacher, or even your 6th grade math teacher. If you're a music person, you're visible, your groups are visible. And I sometimes think that respect is confused with success, because sometimes I think that respect is mirrored in how successful is your program? How many kids do you have in your program? How many competitions have you gone to? How many awards have you gotten? And I think that we should separate success from respect. And I think respect comes from caring about your students and your families, teaching them a solid, approachable, relevant, culturally relevant curriculum, and making sure that you're always striving yourself to be better. And then bringing that back to your students, say, hey, I'm excited about this. Guess what I learned? And I want to teach it to you. And then the success comes on the side, but if the respect isn't there, hard to be successful, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about how respect and visibility seem like the same thing, but are definitely not. And I think I want to tie that back to what you were saying at the beginning with you were applying for a program where it was a community where they expected a certain person. And I think the music ed community being a very small world, there are a lot of us who are going to run into situations where we are out of state, out of our element, or even out of district that we think we would want to teach in. And I wonder if you can speak to branching out and not sticking to, well, these teachers in this area. For example, I'm sure this is true for a lot of our members. I know all the teachers in Western Washington. I feel like I have to teach there because they know me and they respect me. I'm visible there. And so I wonder if you have advice for branching out of that.
I suggest, if you are interested in moving into other areas, because some people do like to be closer to home, and that's also wonderful. But if you are one of those that wants to take a challenge and, let's say, move across the country and teach somewhere else, then do it. Let your resume, your letters of recommendation speak for you. That's where that comes in handy. And if you are offered the position and you accept it and you go there, start laying that groundwork and getting to know your colleagues in music as well, and all the other content areas too. I don't think we should be siloing ourselves. Get to know the PE teacher if you're teaching elementary. Get to know, the math teacher. There's a lot of, or science teacher. There's some great integration projects you can work on. So if you're willing to accept that challenge, go for it. And just make sure that you realize you're going to have to ask a lot of questions because you don't know people there. But there are going to be people there who have also moved from other areas of the country or maybe other parts of the world. And you can definitely start connections and relationships with those individuals to say, hey, when you first moved here and you first started teaching at this school, what were some things that you learned that might benefit me as a new teacher? And I think you'll find that it takes a while. And I'm not going to lie and say that first year of teaching is easy. It's not. I only usually say to my new teachers, you'll never have to go through it again. But you will learn a lot about yourself. Be patient with yourself, ask a lot of questions, because that's what we're expecting. I expect my first year teachers to ask me a lot of questions. If I don't get a lot of questions, I start to get worried.
Great. Thank you so much for that advice. And I think that makes me feel good that we're doing this whole 12-month session, which is based around asking questions for our collegiates. So that's awesome. All right, we're going to bounce down to our advocacy for students questions. And the first one is, based on your experiences in teaching, how can socioeconomic status affect learning in the music classroom, and how do we address this as teachers?
I think that is such a timely question. It's always a timely question, especially in our urban centers, such as where I am in Seattle. But I also think it's a question and a concern that people have looked at for years. As you well know, schools that are in our most socially economically challenged areas are more likely to be the ones that have, I call it the ping pong effect of funding, in the sense of one year you may have a full-time music teacher, let's say in an elementary school, and they can offer 2 sections of band, beginning and advanced, 2 sections of orchestra, same idea, beginning and advanced, and a percussion ensemble class, and that's their full-time job. The next year they're cut 0.6, down to 0.6 FTE, and they can only teach 3 classes. So now the band has to go into 1 class, the orchestra has to go into 1 class, but the percussion class can stay. But there's no ability for those percussion kids that took maybe percussion ensemble last year or last semester to move up. So it's kind of staying at the status quo level of never really advancing, and it's always changing. And maybe the next year goes up to 0.8. And so this inconsistency really is difficult on teachers, on students, on communities. Children who might want to be in band or orchestra that were in that first year when it was full time are now in advanced, but all of a sudden they're now being joined by beginning level kids. Beginning level kids are not getting the attention they need. The advanced kids are feeling bored. The teacher is differentiating as much as they can. And I know that we, as music educators, differentiation is just second nature, but there's only really so much you can do. So there's a stagnation potential where you're not growing as far as your skills on your instrument and your knowledge within music. And so when you move from middle school to high school and you're sitting next to someone who didn't go through that, maybe was able to move through a beginning to an intermediate to an advanced band class during 6th, 7th, and 8th, they have those skills, and the student that's coming from that school that doesn't have that type of support, they, the self-esteem and their success, that's a problem. So that's one of the issues I see. And then I also know that funding is always an issue, because maybe you don't have the budget you need to build and buy new instruments or to buy music and such. So I do think there's a lot of challenges there. And I also know, after all these years of experiences, that this is often where our newest teachers find positions, because there's a revolving door, as we call it, of staffing. Because maybe you're a teacher, you teach there for 1 year, you get knocked down to 0.6, there's an opening at another school in the district or a neighboring district or somewhere else in the country, has 1 full-time position, and you apply and you get it, leaves an opening for somebody to come in. And so I do think that this is something that we are very much aware of here in Seattle. And one of the ways that we try to address it is through communication with principals and through communication with staff, making yourself visible. Make yourself visible. Don't silo yourself and say, okay, I know I'm in this challenging school community. I know that it could change. Great, it could change, and it's a challenging community because of the fact that the funding may not be there. But there's so much you can do there. You build the relationships with the students, with the families, with the family support workers if you have them at your school. We do in our schools that are Title I schools. You build relationships with counselors, and you build relationships with registrars, and you make sure that your ensemble, you select repertoire that your students can play. And you put them out there and let them perform, let them create that energy and that enthusiasm that comes from being able to perform. I think we all know what it's like to get out there, the nerves and the energy, that positive energy. And then what comes from having that successful first performance of the year, it's like, yeah, I can do it. I can do that. Yeah, you can. And then maybe you have so much fun, you tell your friend to join. Then there becomes a problem. How are they going to cut your position if it's growing? And how are they going to cut your program if it's growing? So if you can go in with the mindset of, yeah, I know there are challenges. There are challenges at every school, but I'm going to build relationships. And I'm going to also look at repertoire and at music that really speaks to my students, and that my students have a voice in this decision-making process. And my students have a voice in how we're going to perform and learn. And all of a sudden you become a community of learners. It's not just you as the teacher and the students. And if you can build that energy, I think that visibility will help you a lot. Maybe you still have to deal with a 0.2 cut, but that's better than having the program go away. And again, visibility, from what I have seen for the many years I've been here in Seattle, our teachers are so great at building that, recognition of, here are the kids, let's get them out there. And the kids are the ones that are speaking to the success of the program. And so again, that's another form of success, but that success is coming through the students. And so I do think there are challenges, but I also think there's a lot of possibilities.
That's great. I love that you touched on making a community or making a program build from that shared feeling of, we can do this together. Music is something so universal that everybody can relate to. And that really segues nicely into our next question in the advocating for ourselves as professionals, which is, what steps can we take to get a community to trust you to build a music program in a school?
I'm probably saying this word a lot already, and I'll say it even more before the end of the day, and that is relationship building. I just cannot say it enough. If you will go out there and just get to know people and get to know that community, even people who at first are like, I don't want to talk to you, keep trying, keep trying. It's also important to find out what's going on outside the school within that larger community. What are the alumni? Who are the alumni? The alumni in some of our schools here are incredible resources. I would say at every school, but there are some where they are much more visible than others, I've noticed. And I would say bring those voices in. How can they help you bring visibility to the program? And how are they maybe former music students that were at the school years ago making music? And what are some ideas that they have on how the program should be reinvigorated or reimagined? The other thing too is get to know your students. What are their interests in music? We tend to have this perception of music is band, orchestra, choir. Could you have a marimba ensemble? Maybe that'd be something interesting. What about percussion ensemble? Maybe that's something interesting. What kind of choir are we going to have? What are some other avenues of music that people are interested in, that students are interested in? Maybe they're interested in a recording arts or something to do with computers and composition. There's a lot of possibilities. So I think what we need to do is have that conversation and find out from students, what is it you're interested in with the community? What are the interests that you are hearing about from your community? And then I think it is really having those conversations with admin and being involved in your building and making your voice heard. That is so critical. Be on those committees, be part of, here we call it the building leadership team, or that group of individuals that make decisions about budgets, make decisions about staffing. And those are critical things to do. And then also make sure that you're always professional. That's the biggest thing. Don't ever send an email when you're mad. You can type it, just don't send it, because you will get frustrated. You will get upset. We all do, but don't send that email. Really think. And if there's something that you don't feel like you can send through email, see the person in person if you can. Call them up on Teams or Zoom in this day and age. Or make a phone call, because sometimes that human connection is really what will make things move forward.
I think that's such wonderful advice. And our last speaker, Haley, mentioned something. I think the word she said was, don't be a flake and don't be a jerk. So I think that applies. She was talking about it in the sense of being a performer in the industry, but I think that applies perfectly to the education world. And I wonder, for you, how have you dealt with being a human who has emotions? And especially as teachers, we are so invested in what our students are doing, especially if we're able to make those relationships with students and get to know them. And so I wonder, how do we separate ourselves from those strong emotions, and how do we not send those angry emails, things like that?
Yeah, sometimes it's really hard, and I'm human, you are correct. And there are times where it's like, I am just so frustrated with something. I think you have to give yourself permission for a timeout. I think you have to give yourself permission to say, all right, right now, my emotions are getting the best of me. I need just a moment, like everyone does. And it's not to say that you might have that in the middle of the classroom too, where something has really upset you. I don't know why we would be scared to say to our students, I just need a moment. Just give me a moment. They're going to give you a moment. And they need to see that you need a moment too, that you're human. But I think what you can do is you can journal. I know people journal when they're frustrated. For me, I tend to write on the computer, but I never send it. But what I try to do is take that anger and really break it down and say, what am I really angry or frustrated about? What is it that has set me off? And then I think about it. And then I think about, is that something I have control over or do I not? And if I don't have control over it, there's nothing I can do. And if I do have control over it, what am I not doing or how should I be addressing it? So really bringing it down and thinking about it, why you're feeling that way and how, if at all, you can address it. And then giving yourself time to think about it, because sometimes you can come up with an answer for it and it can change everything. And then sometimes you can't, and you just have to accept that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure those experiences help you move forward and learn from the past mistakes. So the next time something happens where emotions rise, you know how to deal with them a little bit better the next time. That's great.
You hope. That's the goal.
Yes. All right, so our next question is again from our students, advocating for our students. And this one is a really hot topic in the collegiate world, and it has to do with the relevancy of classical music. So this question is, if classical music is often the basis of a music education, how can we provide a meaningful music education to students who may not feel represented by and or have access to this music?
That's a really great question. And that's where, I know the term culturally responsive teaching is coming into play. How do we do that when much of our repertoire that we walk into, especially at the secondary level within orchestra particularly, or even band and choir to some degree, is very Eurocentric. That's not to say we should be throwing that out. That's not what we should be doing. But it's also saying that how are we looking more broadly? Yes, we can definitely look at composers, that women composers, LGBTQIA plus composers. We can definitely be looking at composers of color, looking for composers in our own neighborhood, in our own area. We might have even student composers. So yes, you can look at those aspects as well. But how do we really start stretching and really start thinking about what is the music that we're going to be bringing to our students? And I think one of the words that always comes forward for me is context. What is the context of this music that we're using? And so I really thought long and hard about that, because I know you shared the questions with me ahead of time. And some of the things that come to mind that I think about when I'm looking at a piece of music, and I kind of wrote this down, so I apologize if I'm reading, but I was thinking about, how do students see themselves in the music they're learning or playing in our class? And how am I, as the educator, helping them to see connections in the music they are learning? And what context am I providing? Also, how am I building relationships with my students that will give me insight into their interests, musical or otherwise, and to what their needs are as a young musician? And finally, how am I bringing student voice into the learning of the music? And so those are questions I ask myself quite a bit. So what is the music that my students like to listen to? Who is in my classroom? And I think that's imperative regardless if we're teaching elementary music or secondary music. And also, what are their interests? I know that when we bring in new pieces of music, especially at the elementary level, we need to provide that context. We need to break it down for them. Otherwise, it may not be presented in a way that is authentic or respective of the music that we're trying to present. So for example, if we're going to be introducing world music in our elementary classrooms, then I would strongly suggest that we look at a world music lens. I always think of places like Smithsonian Folkways and there's lots of wonderful music on that resource, as many others. But when we introduce music, working with our students and having the music present itself, to have the music really take center stage, asking students to really reflect and listen, and maybe go through an inquiry-based model of, what is it that you're observing? Where are you making some connections? And then what do you want to learn more about the music, or what questions do you have? You could make it as simple as, what do you hear? What patterns do you hear? Can you find the beat? Can you show me the beat? Very simple things, but it gets them really listening to the piece of music and not being told how they should think about it and how they should receive it. But they're the ones that are leading the learning, and then their voices can actually push the learning of that. So if we're thinking about, oh, okay, so you're hearing these particular instruments. Do we have instruments in our classroom that we could use to represent those sounds? Knowing that maybe we don't have the instruments that are actually the authentic instruments from this music in our classroom, do we have an instrument that could be similar to that? So then you're letting the context and the culture and the musical process of that piece stand out. I think also at the ensemble, the secondary level, when you're looking at pieces of music too, again, asking students, what do you hear in this particular piece? And to draw in, connections. Again, what kind of music do they like to play? What have they played in the past? If you're a new teacher and you're going into the program and you're looking at what they've played in the past, that might give you an idea. But if you're finding it's pretty much Eurocentric, you're going to have to do some research and have to figure out, okay, here's some music that we're going to bring in. And then how do you connect it? Well, maybe they like to play music in the past that's very strict. How are you going to change that idea about rhythm? How are you going to introduce it to them? Maybe you have them listen to this piece or a snippet of the piece, because YouTube is a wonderful medium for that. And you say, all right, what do you hear about this music? Where do you make connections? What do you think about this? So again, a lot of times it's bringing the student into that discussion and asking them, what do you hear? Also thinking about how they can actually lead the learning of a piece of music. I'm going a little bit outside of this question a bit, and I realize that. But I also think that students play a role in teaching a piece of music. I also think students have a role in figuring out how they're going to practice a piece of music. What is some skills they bring to it? Could they have a stand buddy where they're actually talking to each other about, I'm having trouble in measure such and such. What is it that you're doing in that measure to actually make it so that the bowing is more smooth? Well, I'm doing this. They can have those conversations. So again, their voices are leading that learning and leading that work. But again, having those conversations and providing context. What's the historical context? I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, and this is eons ago, but when I was in school, no one ever told me to look up, a composer or to learn about, the music, except for maybe Mozart and Beethoven, because that I remember clearly. But what about having them look up the composer? Do they know who William Grant Still was and the contributions that they made to music? Those types of things I think could be really helpful for students. Then have them bring back that information and share it with the class. Certainly will provide the context. Have them take a piece of music and then arrange it within the confines, of intellectual property and the work's intent. So how could they take a piece of music and make it their own? There's a lot of possibilities. I know I'm making a long laundry list, but there's a lot of possibilities out there of how we can get away from just thinking that the only music we have access to is the music that's more within the Western or Eurocentric domain.
Yeah, I love that answer. And I think that we are all on this train of, yes, we need to broaden the horizons of what music is in our classrooms. But I noticed that some of our members and some practicing teachers currently are worried that when we get student voice and we open up these opportunities like sound production classes and guitar classes and things like that, there's a sense of anxiety that these opportunities will mean that our choirs and our bands and these things that we've trained our whole lives as musicians to teach are suddenly going to become obsolete. And so I wonder if you can speak to how we can balance student voice and the evolving needs of music with traditionalist views, I guess, if that makes sense.
I do. I hear you in that one. And it is something that I know with me and my colleagues here, we've been talking about for many years. I think there will never be, at least I don't perceive there will be ever a time that the music teacher isn't in the room. And they are the expert. They are the academic lead for that subject area. Where sometimes I think there's a fear of student voice is when we haven't built those relationships with students and that element of trust. And that's not to say that the students are the ones that are leading the class from the very beginning to the very end. What it comes down to is, let's say you're practicing 10 measures within a band piece. And you know that you've been telling the kiddos, hey, you know, within these two measures, I really want a crescendo. And then in the last two measures, I want a diminuendo. And it's just not happening there. One way you can bring student voice in is say, all right, what are you hearing? Let's record it. What are you hearing? Do you hear any crescendos or decrescendos? Let me know. And they're probably going to come back. Most of them are going to say no. I'm not hearing it. There are a few that might say I can hear them, but you know that most of them are going to say, not getting it. All right, so what is it we need to be doing to get those crescendos and those decrescendos? Do you think maybe we need to start a little bit louder in the beginning and build? What is it? What do we need to be doing? So that's one way to bring student voice into it. Another way to bring student voice in is after the performance, the responding. You know, if we go back to the standards and we think about where that student voice is, there's student voice written in all of our standards. And so we should be practicing responding no matter what, all through the performance build up as well as the performance itself. And afterwards, response. What did you hear about the performance? You know, what did you feel from the audience? What was your connection with the audience? Okay, so the performance of this piece went really well. We're going to be performing it at a contest or another event down the road. What are we going to do after we listen to this piece? What do you think we can do to make this piece better? What are some things you're willing to work on? All right, so let's go into our sectionals and jot those notes down and let's do some rehearsing. So that's the idea of how to bring that student voice in. Again, you can take it as far as you want. You know, I've seen where teachers have said at the end of the year, okay, you as a class, you're in my advanced band class, I want you to pick a piece of music. Here's some music that I know that you are capable of doing. And I want you as a band to read through these 2 or 3 selections, and then you get to choose which piece it is. And then I want you as a class to figure out how you're going to learn it. I'm here as a resource, but I want to see how you're going to do it. And that way you as the teacher can step back. And what's wonderful about that is you can do a lot of formative assessment. You can see what they know, what they don't know. And it also allows students to build their independence. Because if you think about our true goal with music education, education in general, that is to build independence. And if we never give our students a chance to actually take the ball and run with it, or take the baton and run with it, how do we know what they know? If the goal is, we know we want students to know and be able to do at the end of the day X, if we never give them a chance to show it or demonstrate it, how do we know they know it? So does that help a bit?
Yes, absolutely. And I've never heard it put that way, that we're teaching students to leave as independents. I think that's such a beautiful way to sum up the vast amount of roles we play as educators, but I think that is very beautiful. And I will definitely be copy and pasting that phrase wherever I go.
Please do.
Yeah, okay, so that is a great segue again to our next question. You were just talking about relationships with students and communicating with students. So as professionals, when we're talking about advocacy in the professional or the work setting, what is your advice when it comes to cultivating relationships and communications with school or district administration or admins?
Yeah, the one thing I would say, and this is something that took me a long time to learn, is realize that every principal was once a teacher, or they should have been once a teacher, and that they've been in your shoes before. No one who's sitting in a principal position or some administrative level position hasn't been green as well or brand new to the profession. So know that they also have a lot on their plate, especially right now. And so one of the things I often suggest is, if you're new, is to find out from people who have been there at the school for a while, how does this person like to be communicated with? Some principals love it when you come knock on the door and say, hey, do you have 5 minutes to talk? I really have a question. And some are like, send me an email, or some are make an appointment, or go on the playground and talk to them. So there are different ways. Also ask these colleagues who have been working with this individual, how do they evaluate teachers? What are they looking for in the classroom? What are some basic things that that this principal is going to be looking for? For example, I know certain principals in our district that the learning target better be on the board, because that's the first thing they're going to be looking for. And other principals where they want to see the learning target woven into the lesson. So again, ask those questions. I also think it's important to make sure that you feel like you can talk to your administrator. So never be afraid to send them an email and let them know what your needs are. I will put a word of caution out there, is that sometimes personalities are the way they are, and you just have to figure it out. And that's when, if you feel as if your voice is not being heard, then reach out to someone who can help you with that. Maybe that's a teacher who's been at the school for a while. Maybe that's someone in a position like mine as a music coach, or a teacher on special assignment, we're often called, who can support you in that. You are not alone. Never feel like you are alone. Also, in many schools, the assistant principals or vice principals are the ones who often work with our specialists, our music teachers, visual arts teachers, PE teachers, theater, dance. So a lot of times you may be working with that individual. Again, if you don't feel like you're being heard there, always be respectful and try to work with that person. But if you need to, you go to the principal and ask a question. Again, you're going to have to play those political cards gently. And that's where asking somebody who's been at the school is going to be helpful. Now, if you have a brand new principal, you're all on the same page and you're all learning. So sometimes that can be really good because you're all brand new, they're brand new. It's a new game. But if someone's been there for a while, some principals stay in the school for 20, 30 years. Ask those who've been at the school how it works.
Yeah, I think that's a really great word of caution about the personalities, because I know just even in the music education bubble, there are a lot of big personalities, and we'll be, if you're cultivating communities with your colleagues on that level, I mean, there are so many layers to working with admins at district level and then working with your community of music educators just in your district. And so I think that is really meaningful. And I wonder if you have any, you don't have to go into specifics, but any stories of you and your personality maybe bumping heads with somebody else and how you overcame challenges like that.
Oh, I have many. I can be pretty headstrong in the fact that students come first. End of story. Whatever's best for the students, I'm going to advocate like crazy. And then it's for the teachers as well. So I have had to learn how to gently navigate that. And if I hear somebody say, I don't have time for this, I don't want to talk right now about it, just to say, okay, that's fine. And just keep figuring out a way to get my voice in there so that I can actually say, we need to talk about this because this is what's best for students. And that's been my stock phrase. This is what's best for students. No one can really push back when you say this is what's best for students, or they shouldn't in education. But sometimes they do because they don't have time, and they have too much on their plate, and that's understandable. But you sometimes have to just be persistent, but you have to be respectful of that issue. It's a game. I really don't know any other way to say it, but it's kind of a game. It's like a chess match. Which piece are you going to move at what time? But just keep trying and just be patient and persevere. Perseverance is the name of the game there.
That's such great advice. I think as college students, we're sheltered from the reality of not everybody is the easiest to work with. And it is nice to hear that educators we respect like you have very real personal experiences like this that are, tough in the moment, but will be overcome eventually. So thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's times where you never win. So it's like, okay, I know, but you still should keep trying because you never know, you might actually get in there. So good question.
Okay, and then our last question of the student advocacy is one of my favorites. As many of you know, I'm minoring in special education, and Pam, we talked about this a little earlier, but this question is, how have you encountered including students with disabilities or special needs in the music classroom? And this can branch many different ways. We can talk about IEPs or accommodations or whatever you feel is necessary in your experience.
In my experience, I love working with my special needs students. I have always welcomed all special needs students. I will figure out a way to make sure that they are being served and supported and loved in my classroom. As a choir teacher, it's always been a lot of fun, and a general music teacher, because it's different. You don't have an instrument necessarily. Maybe you have a mallet or you have another instrument. You just figure out what works with them. I also think it's really important to be in good conversation with your special ed teachers and the IAs. They are your lifeline because you may not know what sounds or what gestures or such could be very maybe not well received by a student. I have worked with students who were nonverbal but high functioning, and sometimes if you put one instrument in their hand one day, they love it, put it again in their hand the next day, not having anything to do with it. So how are you going to work with them to figure out what their needs and their interests are? Because they can't tell you in the way that we might be used to, but they are going to be able to tell you in another way. You just have to be open to it. And I think also the joy that they bring and the curiosity, the natural curiosity, I just think it's wonderful to put that in the classroom. I also think it's important to have our special needs students in our classrooms because our students that don't interact with our special needs students on a daily basis, maybe in the general classroom, need to build empathy and respect. And that is one place that they can. And so I've always worked with our special needs students as much as I can in bringing them into the classroom. I think the other thing too is that I can honestly say that for me, I had no training in special education outside of college. I had a few classes where I went to school. We were required to take 3 years of developmental psychology, but it didn't really prepare me for how to teach music with special needs students. It taught me about the science, but not about how to teach. So if you haven't had that experience, I would strongly encourage you to read, to take classes in professional development. It'll really help. The other thing I would like to say is that sometimes music teachers, arts teachers, don't always get access to 504s or IEPs. You have as much right to see those as any other teacher, and you should be seeing those. So if you don't see them or don't have access, please ask for it because it can make a huge difference in your class if you know that a certain student must be in the front row in order to see the board and also to be able to communicate with you. If you don't know that, and you put them in the back row, it can be very challenging for both of you. So make sure you do check those. I do understand that there might be a lot of IEPs, especially if you're a K-5 music teacher, and a lot of 504s, but it's really important that you have that information so that if you do notice something, you can talk with the classroom teacher, with the family, and have that knowledge base. And then if you ever get asked to go to IEP or 504 meetings, try to attend. I attended many as a teacher, and I found it very helpful to hear the parent side or the guardian side, as well as the special education teacher side, and all the other teachers who were maybe interacting with this particular student. So again, it's a wonderful, wonderful gift to bring into your classroom, all the students in those communities. And every student has a right and should have access to music.
Right, beautifully said. And I think this kind of wraps back to maybe an advocacy point as professionals, especially for students who are in self-contained special education classrooms or DLCs. Do you have experience advocating for why they should be in the music classroom with the general education students as opposed to taking music to those self-contained classrooms?
Yes, I've tried to work and advocate for that. Sometimes it's very difficult because, again, I am not a special ed teacher. I am the music teacher. And sometimes it's a timing or a scheduling issue where, it's just they have certain things they need to do in their special ed classroom at the only other time that maybe their like peers can be in music class. So it's an ongoing challenge. I do know that in some schools where I've had the fortune to work, it's been an administrative decision that no, some students in the contained classroom will be integrated into the general music classroom. When I taught years ago in Kansas, all of my special ed students were integrated into my classroom. They were never a separated class. And that was something that the special ed teacher wanted, never had anybody before who would do it. And I said, I will do it. I want to do it. And again, it was something that taught empathy and understanding to the students who were not in those contained classrooms with the students. Maybe they never saw the special ed students because they came to school later and they left earlier. That's how it was in my school. But they got to know who the special ed students were, and they interacted with them more on the playground, at lunch. And so you start building that community, and it's not a separate community. So I think it's something that, depending upon where you are, advocate for. But I also know it can take some work.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for sharing that, because I think educators like you make it look very easy. And when there are things like accessibility that are very important to our generation of music educators that seem very challenging. And so it's nice to hear that the people who make it look easy have also gone through trials and tribulations. And so thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely. And just realize we're all still learning. You are learning all the way through. The only thing that you have is maybe a few tricks in your bag that you've been able to carry over from year to year. So, but you're always learning.
All right. Our last question before we move into the questions, the fun ones that are asked in every session is, have you been put in positions where you taught subjects other than music, and how did you deal with this?
Yes. I just have gone with the flow. Done a lot of reading, professional development. I had to teach PE once. That was interesting. And I've had to teach math, which we should not be doing. We should not be putting me in a math class. I've had to teach, everything I think there is under the sun, especially when I had this situation in my first teaching job where my prep was constantly being taken away from me. It was the last period of the day. So you can imagine everybody was a little bit jealous of that. But I had the last period prep, and people wanted to leave early for sporting events. So I kept being pulled into, sub for whatever class the coach was being pulled out of. And for a year, I thought, okay, that's fine, because I got to know the students, got to also recruit a few. But then at the second year, I thought, this is not a really good use of my time. So I kind of decided I'm not going to do this anymore. So I actually went out and strongly recruited incoming sixth graders and soon to be seventh graders, and created another choir. So lost my prep, but I actually had a choir class. So I don't know if that's a good thing to do, because then you don't have a prep. You're just teaching 6 straight classes. But it was my way of making sure I didn't have to teach math or anything else or science that I should not be teaching students. But if you're having to teach something else, try and see if you can build your programs so that you don't have to teach that class the next year.
Yeah, I know this has been a circulating conversation among teachers right now, that they're feeling like some of their admins are not respecting them as the full-time teachers that they are, because they are called in to sub for other classes so much more often than other subjects. And so I think that's a really important piece of advocacy for ourselves as educators and professionals, that we think about that. And I want to touch back on what you were saying about giving up your planning for another teaching opportunity. Also, I wonder, have you been in situations where you have had to advocate for yourself as a person and say, I am teaching way more than I should, or I need a break in my day for lunch or something like that, where you had to really advocate for yourself in a way that may have felt like you're giving up some of your time for your students?
Yeah, I had to do that. I had a position years ago in New Jersey where they just decided, hey, you're here 2 days a week, and you're going to teach from 8 a.m. until 3:30 p.m. Monday and Friday. And it wasn't, there was no union or anything that basically said, you must have a half an hour duty-free lunch and you get a half an hour prep. And at one point I just said, listen, I can't do this. I need to have at least a half an hour off for lunch. And other teachers, I wasn't alone, fortunately. And their response was, well, can't you just grab a bite between classes? And I said, well, why couldn't I just have lunch when the kids have lunch? And so we had to sit down and figure that out. But yeah, I've had to advocate for myself. And I also had to advocate, many times for schedules that work, that don't, that aren't butting up with no passing period. I'm sure that some of our K-5 music teachers can feel that stress of what it's like to have kindergarten, and then immediately the kindergartners leave and the fifth graders come in and you have no time to reset your brain, let alone your classroom. So you have to advocate for those things. I've had to advocate a lot for that. And I think that there's a lot of importance in there. And I think there's a lot of information that you can share with your administrator, whomever does the schedule, the master schedule, so that you can hopefully get that in there. But yes, you always are constantly advocating for yourself. And I do think, unfortunately, that's just the situation we're always in. Regardless, again, if you're a music teacher or if you're a classroom teacher, you're constantly going to have to be advocating for your well-being.
Yeah, and that's so important. We've had a session in this Q&A cycle that we just talked about self-care and balance as an educator, which is so, so important. And that will bring us to our fun questions that are asked in every session. One of my favorite questions to ask is, what are some self-care tips that you had from the transition from being a college student to being a full-time music educator in the real job field?
I think I learned a little too late that it's important to stop at the end of the day. I still haven't learned that very well, but I will say this. You have to take time for breaks. You have to close the computer. You have to, as my friends used to say, close the office door. You have to say, okay, it's 4:30. I'm done for the day. I'm going home. You can stay at your office. You can stay in your classroom. You can stay in front of your computer at home until 11 or 12 o'clock at night, but you're not doing yourself any good. You need to take time for yourself. You need to make sure that you keep those interests and those hobbies or whatever you like to do. You need to keep those. Don't let the job become everything. Don't let it consume you. When you have breaks, like we're having winter break come up soon, take time off. No one expects you to work. And if they do, there's a problem, and that needs to be discussed. I must say we need to discuss that. So, but you need to take that time off and rejuvenate. It's very important. And you also need to take advantage of what we call sick days. Don't let them accrue. You need to take a personal day, take a personal day, take a mental health day. If you need it, take it. There's no harm in that. In fact, it's good for you to do that. So I think you have to figure out that balance. And if you start finding yourself not liking your job and feeling overtired, it's probably because you're working too much. And I think a lot of times when we're new to a job, whether it be new to the profession and it's your first year teaching, or new to a new position, we want to show everything we can do. We want to be these amazing individuals. You're already an amazing individual. Don't burn yourself out. Take time. Things can wait. Figure out what needs to be done and things that can be put on hold, and take care of yourself.
Great. That's such good advice. And I think as college students being in our music departments, it's very easy to get lost in the community that we build there. And I find myself fielding a lot of, well, I don't even know where to start to get a hobby or anything like that. So I wanted to ask you, do you have any hobbies outside of music that kind of keep you a whole person beyond being a musician?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I do still sing professionally. I do sing with some groups, and but the one thing I do is, believe it or not, I do garden. And there's something about it being therapeutic, going out there and digging in the dirt. And yeah, it's interesting. I've talked to many people who various positions, and yep, I go to the garden, I dig in the dirt. It doesn't talk to me. I don't have to talk to it, and I can just relax and enjoy. So yeah, I think you find that. I do read a lot, even work related. I find that to be pleasurable too, but just reading, and definitely, exercising, working out. I do like to do that. So finding time for those types of things, definitely, I do find time for it.
Great. And I love that those included being outside and movement, which is something that we often lack in the college community. So that was good advice too.
Very much. You need to do that. You need to take care of yourselves.
Yes. All right. So our next question is, what is one thing you wish you knew before becoming a music teacher? And that's kind of a broad question. So take this wherever you'd like.
I wish that someone had told me when I became a music teacher that I would have to teach everything in music. When I think sometimes we think that, okay, I'm only going to do choir, or I'm only going to do band. No, you may have to teach guitar, and you may have to teach band and choir. I wish somebody had told me that becoming a music teacher means you need to know everything, because that's sometimes what the jobs are like when you're coming out from college into the profession. I also wish that people had told me the importance of networking and had actually discussed that before we had graduated, to say, you know, it's really important to keep in communication with people that you've graduated with and with people within your professional organization, and to reach out and to support each other and to support those following you that are coming out as well. Because I often felt like we were all siloed and no one talked to each other. I do hope that's changing, especially because we can get on Teams or Zoom or whatever you have now and just say, hey, how's it going in this class? Hey, what suggestions do you have? I also wish that people had told me how I could advocate for myself. Advocacy was not something that was spoken about. And it wasn't even spoken about, I would say 15 years ago. It was something when I taught college and I had my student teachers out in the field, I said, so how are you going to advocate for yourself? And so I would bring speakers in to talk about advocacy, very similar to what you're doing, Liz, because I thought it was important for students not only to learn how to advocate for themselves, but also how to ask those questions, and what ways to ask those questions. I also wish somebody had told me how to do a budget and how to organize a field trip and how to actually do, get a bus ordered, all those crazy logistics. So again, just some very major ones down to the very minor ones, but it would have been helpful to know how to do those things outside of, can you conduct a 4/4 pattern? Yes, I can, but I don't know how to advocate for myself. Yes. So there you go.
Thank you for mentioning networking, and I will use this as a moment to plug our upcoming 2022 conference, WMEA conference, Collegiates. This is your time to be around other students who are doing exactly what you're doing, but also be around teachers who are probably alumni of your university or your college who really want to talk to you and help you out. So register for conference. It's a reduced rate until January 24th, so make sure you do that. Awesome. So our next question is, what is one thing you wish people outside the music industry knew about being a music education professional?
That is a great question. I would like them to know how vital arts education is to every student. If we are thinking about educating the whole child, the arts must be part of that. And I'm not saying just bits and pieces, maybe a little in kindergarten and maybe a little in high school. No, pre-K through 12, the arts are imperative. And especially now, if we're thinking of social emotional learning and trauma, and such more so now than ever. And also, I wish they would know that when the arts are removed, it has an impact on our students, because sometimes the only reason why our students come to school maybe is because of a music class or a theater class or a visual arts class. I also wish that people knew that sometimes when a child is in a music class or an arts class, whatever it may be, it is the only space that they feel that they can be themselves, because it's an environment in where they feel that they're part of a community. And the arts are a community. If we think back to, especially in high school, if you're in choir, band, or orchestra, or even in theater, or what marching band, just think of that camaraderie you had. That's really important to our children. And to have that pulled away, or have it, as we discussed with the socioeconomic situation in some of our schools, to have it sometimes and not, I say it's like taking candy away from the child. It's really detrimental. So I wish people understood the value and the importance of the arts, and the fact that it needs to be consistent, and it needs to be equitable, and it needs to be accessible, and there should not be any barriers for any of our children to access arts education.
Yeah, very well said. And I think that ties nicely into this idea that I think there's a saying that everybody remembers their favorite teacher or has a lasting impact from their favorite teacher. I think the same is very true about any music experience. I can't think of a single person I've met in my whole life who hasn't been impacted by music in some way, or music education for that matter. And so what you're saying is very relevant and just very on the nose of should be no reason that anybody doesn't have access to a quality music education, because it does make us whole human beings who can relate to each other much better. So thank you for saying that.
Absolutely. I say it all the time.
Yeah. All right. So our last question of the session is always one of my favorites, and it can be funny for us who have not had students yet. It could be challenging and traumatic for you teachers who have gone through it. But do you have any funny classroom management stories, and what were the lessons that came out of it to help you combat that misbehavior later?
Oh my, yes, I do. So I decided that I've subbed quite a bit in my life, and I've subbed most of the time, some of the time in music, but most of the time in other content areas for whatever reason. But one time I was subbing in a band class, a middle school band class, and the ensembles were quite large. And one of the classes was about 100 kids, and it was the top ensemble. And I had a list of all the pieces we were supposed to go through, like warm-ups and long tones and such, and then to do a Bach chorale. And being a singer, I kind of know Bach chorales pretty well. And so I kind of knew this particular chorale, and I knew how it was supposed to sound. And I also had heard this group perform several times before, so I knew what they were capable of. And so I'm getting ready to start them, and all of it, and it just sounds horrible. It's like, what is going on here? It's like, try that again. And so we tried again. And then I realized, I looked over and I went, that is strange, because the clarinetists are holding the clarinet incorrectly, right hand over left. And the trumpet players are holding the horn incorrectly. What I noticed is that the wind players had literally switched instruments. And so that was their way of testing me. And so I looked at them, I said, I know this Bach chorale, and I know it sounds better than this, and I know you guys can play it better than this. I'm going to give you, to the count of 3, to get the right instrument in the right hands, clean the mouthpiece, and we're going to start again. And if we don't want to do that, we can do these lovely theory sheets that I just found. They immediately switched those instruments because they didn't want to do theory sheets. So one of the things I often found is that homework was a really good dangling thing. It's like, if you don't get your assignment done, you have to do homework. Or if you're not going to follow the directions, we're going to do this. And the last thing they ever want to do in a music class is have homework outside of practicing, of course, and to do worksheets. So.
That's awesome. There's always a negotiation piece to it where if we do it right, that's awesome. Yeah, well, thank you so much, Pam, for being here today and sharing such amazing expertise and wisdom. I know all of the collegiate members who watch this video later are really going to have a lot to take away from this conversation. So again, thank you, Pam, for being here. And I hope you come join us for another session down the road, because CWMEA really benefits from people like you.
Thank you so much, Liz. I wish you and everybody who watches this all the best in your future endeavors. And again, it's my pleasure to support any and all of you. And I look forward to seeing many of you at WMEA very soon.
Great. And that's a great segue. Again, I want to plug, make sure you sign up for conference, register now. It's $39 for the reduced rate, and it will go up after January 24th. Speaking of January, this is a monthly session. So we will have another session just like this with another amazing music educator like Pam. And information about that will be up on our CWMEA Instagram page. So be on the lookout for that. In the meantime, have a great break, everyone, and I hope to see you soon.